Hi everybody, my name is Poppy Bowers and I'm exhibition curator at the Whitworth Art Gallery. I'm lead curator of a new project at the gallery called Economics the Blockbuster, which will take the form of an exhibition in late 2022. And as part of the project's research activity, I'm working with John Byrne at the City Lab, Liverpool John Moores University, and Alessandra Saviotti from the Association of Arte Utile. And together we're organising the Decentralising Political Economies website, which you're now on. And this is a live platform for us and for others to speculate and test new frameworks to use art and its institutions as tools for social change and activism. And today I have John Byrne with me. John is the lead researcher and research editor of DPE.tools. He's a reader in the uses of art at Liverpool John Moores University, where he's also the director of the Uses of Art City Lab. I'm going to ask John just a couple of questions as a way of introducing some of the thinking and aims behind the DPE platform. So hi, John.
Hiya.
One of the activities of this website is to continue the thinking around the concept of arte utile and the practical application of one-to-one scale practice and constituent-led working. So to give a bit of grounding to this, I thought I'd start by asking you to describe some earlier projects that you've been involved in that have informed the DPE platform.
Okay, it's a really good question, and there's a kind of range of projects that I've been involved in terms of one-to-one scale art practice over about a decade and a half, 15 years, on its way to 20 years now, which have had quite an impact on my thinking and doing and other people's thinking and doing, and have kind of helped to lead us to where we are. I guess the most significant of them really sort of follow quite a set of almost logical steps, actually accidentally logical steps. The first real introduction I had to one-to-one scale art practice, as it became known, was actually back in 2006 when Grisdale Arts had an exhibition as part of Liverpool Biennial and called Virtually Grisdale, which I was really intrigued by. And then, as fate would have it, I was invited to chair a discussion at the British Art Show in Nottingham later that year, where I bumped into Adam Sutherland, who was one of the speakers on the panel, and he was director of Grisdale Arts. And we kind of hit it off immediately. And one of the reasons we hit it off is at the time we both shared a real interest in trying to rethink how we might both make and construct and experience an art practice that wasn't predicated on having objects that were put in spaces. Mm-hmm. And what was really interesting for me with the work of Grisdale Arts is they had a sort of a real challenge and urgency to think that one through. Grisdale Arts is a commissioning agency, essentially, which is based on a small farmhouse up in the hills in the Lake District, in an area of designated natural beauty, next to Brantwood, where John Ruskin used to live. And Grisdale Arts had initially been quite a traditional sculpture park. You used to go to the countryside and look at things in the countryside. When Adam Sutherland took over, they began to shift that relationship, and they began to work with artists and not give those artists studio spaces, and they began to ask the artists to make themselves useful, which led to a whole plethora of interesting projects and very few shows. It was quite curious that I met them via a show in Liverpool Biennial. And it was through Adam Sutherland and his introduction to then Deputy Director of Grisdale Arts, Alistair Hudson, who's now Director of Whitworth Art Gallery, long-term collaborator, that I began to get reinterested in John Ruskin. Mm-hmm. And that was really important for me as well in terms of one-to-one scale practice, because I first met Ruskin when I was a foundation student many years before. And at that point, Ruskin always was a sort of figure who walked onto the drama of modern art quite early on. And via a court case with the American painter Whistler back in 1878, in which Whistler sued Ruskin for libel. Ruskin became seen as a kind of neoconservative poster boy, somebody who was stridently against progress, was stridently against autonomous art, and wanted to look back towards earlier periods and somehow reclaim a medievalist fundamentalism. And what Adam and Alistair were interested in doing was kind of excavating that historical period and actually finding that Ruskin was a very challenging and radical figure, and the consequences of that trial, art went either autonomous or didn't, wasn't anywhere near as simple as we'd like it to be. And what we began to think through was that one of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution and the idea of art becoming autonomous was that it lost its relationship with use and use value. And we began to be interested because it was clear to demonstrate that that relationship had been there as a large part of what we would now call art practice in the past, one in which was much more embedded and integrated. So as a kind of very early form of one-to-one scale art practice, Ruskin, when he lived in the Lake District, was kind of a player in developing a mechanics institute in the small village of Coniston, which was then a very working class mining town. It's hard to imagine that now if you've been to the UK and you've been to Coniston. It's a tourist destination and it's beautiful. So it's really hard to get your mind back to think that that was actually a very poor industrial working setting. And Ruskin wanted to play out his radical ideas about rethinking how education could happen, with art at its centre, and rounded education in sciences, literature, poetry. And he was really interested in the idea of use and doing. So we were really interested in those ideas, and that led to a whole kind of set of projects, really. While we were developing those ideas, one of the contacts who was working a lot with Grisdale Arts and the Van Abben Museum was the artist Tanya Bagheera, who was developing the Association of Art Utile. And Tanya was keen to develop workshops around what useful art could be. And one of the things that intrigued me during these discussions was the development of 8 sort of flexible ideas or core principles, if you like, of useful art. And one of them, which appeals to me very much, is that art should no longer be a symbolic gesture where you make something in a gallery space, which through a special experience of art suggests a way through an impasse, although that has its own uses and values for sure. But that artists should actually begin to use their creative skills to work with people in particular circumstances to help them find a way through those processes and impasses in the real world. And that also leads to one of the tenets that art should be one-to-one scale. And I became really, really interested in the idea of what happens when artists are part of groups of people who are working on projects that are really trying to solve social, political, and economic urgencies, and how that relates or not to museums and galleries. That led to a couple of things really quickly, I guess. There was a major show in the Van Abben Museum, which was also a part of the L'Internationale's project, The Uses of Art, Legacies of 1848-1989, which was a Tanya Bagheera show essentially, and it was called the Museum of Art Utile. And that appealed to me because it was an attempt to imagine what a museum of the future might look like. if it was based around one-to-one scale art practice.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an uncomfortable exhibition in one way, because we are still living with the legacy of an exhibition space that puts things on display by which you understand the world. And that tends to begin to fall down when you're looking at one-to-one scale art practices that are about actions and activities in the real world. You're effectively documenting them and reposition them in a gallery space, usually with the syntax and grammar of post-it notes and diagrams and pieces of string, etc. But what really struck me about that show was that the Van Abbe Museum were able to, and were also brave enough to allow any communities or interest groups to come in and use those spaces in order to hold seminars and workshops and discussions.
Right.
In order to activate the work and the art that was there as a means to think through and solve their own urgencies. And because that, it became statistically one of the most popular shows that the Van Abbe Museum has ever had, and also set myself and several other people thinking that there might be something in this shift towards the idea of a museum and gallery as a kind of, as Charles Escher put it, as a kind of a power plant that kind of enables us to rethink who we are and what we do and why we do it. A couple of things followed that quite quickly. There was a show that was curated by Alistair Hudson again, called Confessions of the Imperfect, again at the Van Abbe Museum, which looked at the legacy of John Ruskin. And Ruskin's idea, his quote, "Confessions of the Imperfect," was about his interest in the humanness of making.
Right.
Ruskin, one of the reasons Ruskin wasn't so keen on Renaissance art wasn't because he didn't think it was good. He did. He was worried that its excessive geometry was taking out the evidence of the human hand, of our agency, and was part of a historical shift towards just making us part of a machine. And so Ruskin's more radical ideas are about how can we use art to allow ourselves to be imperfect, to be able to contribute, to be able to make, to be able to do, which again appealed to me a lot. In 2013-14 with Grisdale Arts, as part of a show at Tate Liverpool called Art Turning Left, we managed to install an Office of Useful Art as part of that exhibition. So that became a space in which anybody could go in and propose to undertake an activity, etc. I used that a lot with my students. That was quite a pretty successful thing.
Was that taking on developing from the Museum of Art at Utiel? Was that using the Art at Utiel archive, or was that something?
Yes, it was linked to the Association of Art at Utiel. We had literally no physical space to be able to install any of the Art at Utiel archive, which is a kind of an online resource of one-to-one scale art practices, both contemporary and historical, that try to solve solutions. But there was more than a nod to the Association of Art at Utiel. If you came into the office and did something, you were offered membership of the Association of Art at Utiel. The 8 points of Art at Utiel were on the wall. And one of the ideas was to try to think through any of the workshops or activities that took place there, how art could be useful and could be some kind of functioning tool. And that kind of then led to I helped to instigate and install a pop-up Office of Useful Art in Liverpool John Moores University in the Exhibition Research Lab in 2015. And the idea of that was that we would work with the Visible Award, which was a project that concerned itself largely with one-to-one scale art practices and awarded a prize to the artists who'd been, in a sense, the most effective in the previous 2 years in order for them to be able to develop and process their project. So we had this Office of Useful Art that led up to a meeting and a decision that would be publicly made about who should win the prize, which took place in Liverpool Town Hall. So this was a kind of a legacy of this exhibition, and also the Office of Useful Art. And literally at that time, Assemble, who were working in Liverpool in Granby at the time, were shortlisted for the Turner Prize. And later that year, subsequently won the Turner Prize with their work with Granby Four Streets. So a kind of a collision of things was happening, which was really, really, really exceptionally interesting. Assemble winning the Turner Prize, and Alistair Hudson was one of the judges of the Turner Prize that year. Both in terms, it was interesting in terms of the art world started to legitimise one-to-one scale art practice. People became oddly interested in it because it could win the Turner Prize, therefore it had to be a thing. And at the same time, there was a series of debates, some of them were played out in eFlux, where there was probably an understandable, quite a concern that the shift towards useful art would rob art of its magical specificity. That useful art was somehow utilitarian and conservative, like Ruskin, and would play art into the hands of political power. And what we began to argue was that, well, that's not necessarily the case, because neoliberal political power is kind of now pervasive and everywhere. So it's not as simple as having a safe haven in a museum or gallery space, which you can walk out of a neoliberal political situation, have an experience of art. The collection of art objects and their positioning within museum and gallery spaces is as much part of that neoliberal economy as anything else. And that whilst for sure art can be used by soft political power, you know, the kind of the new Labour idea that socially engaged art practice is good and would make people happier, it can also be used by those very same people as a tool for them to regain local power and manage their own lives and produce their own economies, and to voice an alternative to centralized political decisions. So that really led us to continue to developing those ideas, which kind of has brought us to the point where we are today, I guess, with Alistair being a director of the Whitworth and us developing this Decentralising Political Economies website to begin to not only discuss these issues further, but to try and see how they can affect the working mechanisms of a contemporary art gallery in relationship to its local, national and international environment.
Yeah, and I guess a recent project I had in mind as well was your work as a lead editor on the Constituent Museum book, which was part of a research strand that was of a wider project with the Internationale Confederation that you referred to earlier. And that was quite recent, that was just a couple of years ago. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about, the kind of importance of the constituent-led within your own research. I mean, I guess you've touched on it a little bit, but...
I think you're right. I think that's really important. I think one of the consequences of all of this work that went on, these relationships with one-to-one scale art practice, was the development of the project that I touched on. The L'Internazionale Confederation of Museums and Galleries undertook a 5-year-long project called The Uses of Art Legacies of 1848-1989, as a means to rethink themselves and what museums and art galleries could do and to look at use. And one of the research strands that emerged from that was the constituencies research strand, which I was asked to lead up. And that really began to emerge because one of the curious and interesting things that we found is that whilst there was an absolute buy-in from directors and staff involved in the museums and galleries of the L'Internazionale into the idea that art should be something other than it is at the moment, and should be far more accessible to and integrated with audiences and users.
Mm.
But what stopped or prevented that was almost a 200-year pyramidal tradition of organizational management and an art world, which tended to prevent that shift from happening.
Mm-hmm.
So you have all of this energy and all of this buy-in, but there's a lock-in as well with the rhythms of exhibition making, the ideas of what art is and what it can be, curatorial imperatives, X, Y, and Z. And how do you go about changing them? You can't just change them overnight. Just saying that you want to change them doesn't actually do much. Mm. So what the constituencies research strand became about, which was a really interesting thing to work with the staff from those museums and galleries on, was a kind of almost an open discussion in which we tried to identify projects that would be tactical and day-to-day examples of how to begin that process of change.
Right.
And one of the ideas that emerged from that is those changes would have to be constituent, i.e. it was no good a museum and gallery saying we will open a space, physical and ideological, within our environment in which we can talk to an audience about how they might experience and use art otherwise. There had to be a sort of feedback loop where a museum and a gallery would become one constituency amongst other constituent stakeholders, and that the projects that they undertook would not only offer a transformative value in some way, shape or form to those external stakeholders, but would also be able to change the institution itself and its operating systems and how it might think. So a kind of a shift towards a softer, more flexible, responsive and process-based institutional thinking, which again could operate as an example of how other institutions, not necessarily art institutions, might begin to think of working. So the publication, the Constituent Museum book that you mentioned, became an attempt to make a first small step in that process by, yes, commissioning essays from various people looking at how you might going about doing this, but perhaps more importantly, having a series of examples and case studies of quite tactical, possible day-to-day projects which began to affect change and make those new ways of making and doing possible. I began to call that negotiating jeopardy. The idea for me that it's a negotiation, but there is you have to be careful. There's a jeopardy involved. There are values that are cherished. Some of them are good, and moving them and shifting them on is a process of negotiation, and finding ways to do that is probably the next key step.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Is, I mean, that's brilliant to sort of have a kind of sense of the trajectory that you've kind of your thinking's been on since like 2006, I think you started, and kind of wanted to think about what for you have been the sort of shifts that you've noticed in that time, because you mentioned, there are some contentious kind of like points in that. One being the term useful, another one, and there's tell me about what you think has shifted.
I think there's been a lot of shifts, and for me they're kind of interesting. When we first began to discuss and debate and talk the idea of useful art, it was genuinely often met as some kind of anathema. When I took part in some debates back in 2006 onwards, early days, when there was just kind of a dismissive hostility to the very idea that art might or could be useful, because that would be the opposite of what art is. And that was subsequently backed up with the idea I've mentioned before, that any shift towards art being useful would be neoliberalism in disguise. Art had to remain intransigently useless in order for it to offer us any insight into a way out of or beyond our current dilemma. So that was where one of the first changes took place. We began to work with theorists and practitioners who were more interested in the idea that these difficulties were now asymmetrical. Liam Gillick, for example, is just one artist who was writing very, very clearly about the hijacking of the terms that would usually once have clearly defined an artistic process and an artistic way of life by a neoliberalism that wanted to not only justify but wanted to make exciting precarious labour. You know, you're in control of your life. This is, you know, you don't have to stick to one job. You can move around. You can do the things you want. You know, you're creative at what you do. And there were lots of projects developing around about that co-option of art speak by managerial speak. So, as I said, what began to be exciting for me was that notion that this struggle is asymmetrical, that it's no longer useless versus the useful. So one of the ways I began to look at it was to be able to argue it's not the tools that we pick up to use, it's how we use the tools we pick up. So that became a kind of an interesting kind of nub. And some of those, you know, it has a long tail. Those debates are still ongoing, and they flared up when Assemble won the Turner Prize, but it was really, really interesting. But what has happened as well is those debates, which were once seen as kind of peripheral, for one reason or another, have become kind of quite central. And there are more and more people and practitioners and makers and doers and curators and directors and communities and constituencies who are interested in using art and want to have a stake back in what art is and what art production is. So it isn't just done by special people that you go to look at, they want to use it too. And that's begun to, I think, genuinely, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, shift debates and ideas. And I think because of that, that is a big change. And that's why I'm very excited about our Decentralising Political Economies project, because we've kind of been able to make the decision that we don't necessarily have to reinvent that wheel and reinscribe that debate. We can use it as a resource and point to it, but we can say, okay, what next? What would happen if? Which you eloquently put at the start of the discussion by saying what DPE is going to attempt to make propositions which you can test and discuss, and do that in a relationship to a museum like the Whitworth, who actually wants to begin to think itself through too.
Oh, that's great, thank you. Well, I think that gives us a really good ground from which then people watching this can hopefully go away and find their own entry points into the website. So thanks so much, John.
No problem. Looking forward to the project itself and working with you on it. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. Okay.
Sound?